In this screencast, we'll look at animation techniques in Adobe Photoshop through the use of Photoshop's timeline frame animation feature and tweening techniques. The timeline can be found under the window menu item at the top, Timeline. This launches the dialog box at the bottom. You can select between video timeline and frame animation. For our examples, we'll be concerned with frame animation. Selecting that and clicking the button launches the frame animation timeline. Now let's look at our first example. In this example, we're going to show how to animate the position of an object. Let's come over to our Shape tool. Our Ellipse tool is selected. Let's come up to our Mode and make sure we have Shape selected. Holding our Shift key down, we'll draw out a proportion circle, and let's add some color, magenta. Close our Properties box. And as you notice, our artboard, which is 600 pixels wide by 300 pixels tall, is reflected down here in our timeline. Let's add a second ending position for our object by duplicating the first frame. And as you notice that they are reflective of each other, with our Move tool and our second frame selected, we can change our position to our ending state. It'll just be a perfect linear progression. And so now we have a start state and an ending state. These are our keyframes in which we'll fill in the in-between frames with our Tweening tool, which is here, or it can be found in the flyout menu here. The dialog box allows you to set some parameters. We can set the amount of frames that we will do our animation with. Currently it's set to 10. The more frames you add, the smoother the transition between the beginning and the ending state. It also increases the file size. So it's a judgment call on how many frames you would like to use. I'm going to use 10. It's a little bit generous, but for this example, it'll suffice. We can also animate the position, the opacity, and the effects. In this example, we're only concerned with the position. Let's click OK, and you notice in our timeline we went from 2 frames to 12 frames, filling in the transitions between frame 2 and frame 11. Let's play this. We have our cycle set to once. You can set this to 3 times forever or specify your own. We'll leave it at once. Let's hit play and see what happens. So it's moving kind of slow. And if you notice here at the bottom, it's set to 0.2 seconds. So if I shift click, I can select all frames and change every frame together. I'll set to no delay, or you can set them independently so you can do ease ins and ease outs. And let's run this one more time, and you can see that this is moving much faster. This is animating the position of an object. In this example, we're going to look at animating opacity to create a transition in color as our circle from our first example travels from the left side of the frame to the right side of the frame. First, let's start by duplicating our ellipse layer, Command J. That will give us an exact duplicate of our ellipse 1. And let's change the color property from magenta to a cyan. Click OK. And we can see as we toggle on and off that we have in our first keyframe 2 ellipses, one on top of each other. So with our second ellipse, our cyan ellipse, let's take the opacity down to 0. So it gives us the illusion that we only have one ellipse in our keyframe. Let's duplicate our ending state, selecting both layers, ellipse 1 copy and ellipse 1, and our Move tool. Let's create our ending state, our second keyframe. And what we want to do is then turn our opacity back up to 100% while taking the opacity down to 0 in our magenta layer. And as we toggle off, it appears that only the cyan circle is left. So we have 2 states, 2 keyframes, the beginning and our end. So with our tween button, we can set our layer to our frames to 10. Let's make it 15. And we are going to animate position and opacity. Click OK. And you can see now we have 17 frames in our animation. Let's change the timing. Well, the timing is pretty slow, so let's leave it here and see what we get. So that's really slow. So let's click Shift and take out to no delay and run this one more time. And that's how you animate a transition with opacity. Okay, so what just happened? Up until this point, we've been looking at animating position and opacity. In this example, we're going to animate position again, but instead of taking an object and moving it from one point to another, we're going to take a mask and move that from one point to another. So let's quickly draw out with our shape tool 3 masks to cover our letters A, R, and T. And you notice in our palettes menu, we have rectangle 1, 2, and 3. And so 1 was for A, 2 was for R, and 3 was for T. We are going to use clipping masks. And clipping objects to a specific layer or taking an adjustment layer and clipping it to a specific layer allows you to affect just that layer. So holding the Option key and hovering your mouse between the 2 layers and clicking once allows you to attach this mask to the letter T. We're going to attach rectangle 2 to R and rectangle 1 to A. And so we can close our properties menu. So we have our first keyframe. There's nothing visible. Let's click out our ending keyframe and let's run through our shade effect. And with our move tool, we're going to click and drag open T, click and drag open R, and click and drag open the letter A. Now you notice that I'm dragging them back over each letter, but yet they're not being affected. And that's the power of clipping your effect to a specific layer. Otherwise, it would just take that white box for A and move it over and cover the letter R. And the R over T, and T, of course, not covering anything, but clipping it to a specific layer allows you to affect just that layer. So here we have our 2 keyframes, our start and our stop. And with our tween, we'll put 15 frames in. We're really just affecting position at this point. We could affect opacity, but we'll just do it for position. Let's run this. And there it is, animating position of a clipping mask. So these are a few ways to work with the frame animation palette.